Hello everyone, and welcome to Module 6, which is on Europe. So this is the word cloud that you guys came up with for Western Europe. It seems that you have a rather high opinion of it. You find it very beautiful. You'd like to travel there. You think it's a diverse continent with a lot of culture. You think it's advanced. You think they're wealthy. I see history here, so your history and historical both quite prominent, so you're well aware of Europe's role in world history, and probably a lot of people, when they think of history, will think of old European buildings and kings and queens, etc. So this is a good snapshot of where we're at. And of course, we've got soccer, although they would call it football. So here's an interesting map showing Europe if it were superimposed on top of North America. It's much smaller in terms of land, but in terms of population, it is much larger, meaning there's a lot more density in Western Europe. And remember, we're not really talking about Russia here. That'll come later in the semester. And also, Europe aggregated as a whole is the largest economy in the world, while the US and Canada are very close second. And here's another visualization of that. Here's a map which adjusts regions' size based on their total GDP. So you saw something like this early on in the human geography part of the course. But as you can see, North America, Western Europe, Japan and South Korea, all very large. Western Europe, in this case, slightly larger. South America, Latin America, here we've got Mexico, quite small. Africa nearly disappears. Central Asia nearly disappears. We can see China and India kind of holding their own. When we're thinking about world history, an important force that has exerted itself throughout history, throughout the history of Western thought, and also current Western thought, so that means us really, because here we are in the Western Academy, is Eurocentrism. So this is the viewing of the world from a European perspective, as if Europe were at the top, we're the center of things. And it includes an implied belief in the preeminence of Europe and European culture, and then, by extension, the United States and the West in general, and Western culture. And so this has been propagated throughout history by material events, so Europe forcing this idea upon others, assuming it of itself. And it's a trend that many in academia in our work have been trying to outgrow, basically. It's an outdated view of the world that was never accurate. So here we have a cartographer who proposed an alternate view of the world. After all, there is no up or down in outer space. So what if we turned the familiar map upside down? Why shouldn't the South Pole be on top? Why shouldn't the global South be on top? But looking at it, because we've been raised, most of us in Western classrooms, it looks very strange to us to see the world in this way. So Europe is incredibly important to world history and world economic development. As I mentioned, Europe has had a huge impact on history and geography, both in terms of actual history and actual geography, carving up the world, but also in terms of texts and maps. So in terms of the thoughts and ideas that have defined the world and have come to be dominant in the world. And then, of course, the process of naming things as relative to Europe. So the Middle East, for instance. We're going to talk about it next week, and I'll go into much greater depth there, but the modern Middle East is in many ways simply a discursive invention at the time, mostly European academics, politicians, geographers were guilty of this. And Europe has also played an active role in increasing global integration historically. So one way that it did this is through colonization and imperialism. Another way is through a lot of technologies that originated or were implemented by Europe and European countries. So an older example of this would be something like the sailing ship and the age of exploration. A much newer example would be well, not much newer, but somewhere in the middle, we've got the steam engine. The steam engine shrank the world by making it, you could get from place to place more quickly. And then finally, much more recently, modern telecommunications and transportation. And of course, there's a link between the shrinking of the world in terms of transportation and communication, and the reason that Europe wanted or needed to do that, which was economic. The European economic juggernaut needed raw resources to continue to grow, to continue to sustain itself. And so that is one of the underlying reasons that European countries established colonies overseas, which of course was what the exploration was for. And the historical legacy of this impact on the world, shrinking the world through technology, through exploration, the establishment of colonies, and through extraction of more and more resources and use of more and more resources, has been to give us a legacy of unevenness, of very rich areas and very poor areas, areas with a lot of built-up infrastructure, areas with less well-established infrastructure, areas with infrastructure that makes sense and that doesn't, so on and so forth. So another way of thinking about Europe as separate from North America, separate from East Asia, is this theory of triadization, right, which contends that rather than globalization, actually there's three regions, meaning North America, Western Europe, and Japan and East Asia, that have actually experienced integration of financial markets. Recent developments have sort of put this theory on the back burner, put it to rest, because the effects of globalization are being seen in more and more places. The global economy is getting more and more interlinked, so that a place like China, for instance, is clearly affecting global markets. For the past few months, as good or bad news has been coming out of the Chinese economy, it's been reflected almost immediately in Western stock markets. All right, let's look a little more closely at the history of European imperialism. So here we have a map showing the acquisitions of different European countries throughout the world at the time of the triangular trade. So this was the basis for merchant capitalism, starting in the 15th century. So as I mentioned, Europeans were shrinking the world through the advent of new technologies, new innovations, such as navigation. So how do you get the ship from place to place? And shipbuilding. How do you build faster and larger ships that can move more resources more quickly? Again, in effect, further shrinking the world. The establishment of international trade and exploration, and then, of course, if your system is based on growth, then you need to expand the sphere of your influence, expand the places from which you can extract raw resources, and turn it into wealth. This led to the next stage of European historical and economic development, industrialization. So the Industrial Revolution is often thought to have occurred in three waves, starting in England and Germany moving on to Belgium, Holland, France, and then from there to the rest of Europe. And here we have, you've probably heard the phrase, "the sun will never set" on the British Empire. So this was meant in Victorian times to be very literal. This is a map of the British Empire in the 1920s. So you can see, even after World War I, or I should say especially after World War I, because the British Empire got to absorb some of the colonies from the losing side of the First World War, we can see that it was truly a global empire. And I've traveled a lot in South Asia, Southeast Asia, and you can really see the legacy of the British Empire. Many of the streets are still laid out in the same way. There's the same sort of clock tower in the same center of every town square. But more than that, more than sort of the easy-to-spot surface-level similarities, there's the historical legacy, which for the most part is negative, of the economic impact of British imperialism on those places. So there's kind of a myth, for instance, in India. There are some imperialist apologists who will say, oh, the British Empire was great for India in these places. They built all of this infrastructure. They gave them trains. The reality is that when the British colonized India, India at the time manufactured a lot of stuff. But manufacturing is the lucrative part of the economic process. The place that provides the raw materials gets a much smaller share of the total value of a product compared to the place that takes the raw materials and manufactures them, turns them into a final product. So under British colonialism in South Asia, this rich history of manufacturing, although it wasn't industrial in the sense of steam engines and the Western European Industrial Revolution, there was lots of stuff being manufactured there. This changed. The British kind of rolled back the clock in terms of manufacturing, and they reorganized the South Asian economy around extraction. So the train lines that are there, for instance, weren't designed from the perspective of, what would be a convenient train system for Indians to move from place to place? What would make the most sense for getting from Delhi to Mumbai, for instance? No, these train lines were built along networks of extraction. So how can we get raw materials as quickly and efficiently and securely as possible from the interior to the coast, to ports where they can be taken to other parts of the empire, where they can be taken back to England? So in addition to these surface level legacies that you'll be able to see very easily if you've traveled to any of these places, there's also economic and political legacies that continue to this day and will continue to be easily recognizable for quite some time. This system really that started in the 15th century was not dismantled fully until the late 20th century. And as I mentioned, the legacies are still alive and well. So it's debatable whether it's been fully dismantled, but at least in terms of formal colonization, or what could be said to be the age of imperialism, that ended in the late 20th century. There was one large round of this shortly after World War I, when basically all the countries that were on the losing side of World War I had to give up their colonies. Then, during the Great Depression, a lot of countries, European countries, could no longer afford or no longer could deal with the expense, the headache of having colonies abroad. Although, of course, colonies continue to be sources of profit, they are difficult to manage. And then finally, after World War II, even the victors lost their appetite for imperialism because Europe itself was decimated. So here we've got a picture of Dresden, Germany, of course on the losing side of World War II after the war. But London was not too much better off, and the British wanted to focus on rebuilding at home. And so that's why in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and then even into the 60s, we saw a lot of colonies finally gaining their independence, especially in Africa. This happened very late in a lot of cases. And Burma, where one of the places that I've seen firsthand what a former British colony looks like, gained their independence in the late 1940s. India and Pakistan, mid-1940s. So after this age of imperialism, after World War II, the grand historical, the defining historical event for Europe was, of course, the Cold War and the so-called Iron Curtain, dividing Western Europe from Eastern Europe. And to some extent, post-1990s, post-turn of the millennium, at least Central Europe, if not Eastern Europe, looks a lot more Western European, has become much more integrated with Western Europe, but the legacies are still there, and I'll talk in a little bit more depth about that in a moment. But first, let's discuss the European Union. So what is this thing, the EU? Well, it's the culmination of a few stages of unification of Europe through time. So in 1952, this started off with a European coal and steel community. So in economic integration just in a few particular sectors, which then 5 years later expanded to include entire economies. In 1992, this eventually led to the advent of the EU, more or less as we know it today, with the four freedoms being the freedom of movement of goods, services, capital, and people, and economic and political integration. So if you're traveling through Europe, of course, you'll find linguistic differences, but as you're crossing borders, it won't feel, you won't necessarily notice. It wouldn't be that much more recognizable than if you were crossing, say, from Ohio to Michigan. You might even notice that one more. The rationale behind the EU is, first of all, to ensure autonomy from the US. So the US, of course, as a global leader, if it had bilateral relations with each European country, which of course it does, but if trade were being determined that way, then the Europeans would be divided and conquered, so to speak. So Europe said, we'll have more autonomy from the US if we're counting ourselves as one cohesive region rather than a whole bunch of individual states. And thus will be more competitive with the US and Japan. Of course, also, it gets Germany and France to cooperate with one another, to be on the same page, to prevent further conflict. And then finally, to make life easier in Europe, to do business, to work and live in different places with less determination from one's birthplace. So the use of a common currency, the euro, the coordination of economic policy, the redistribution of wealth from within countries and between countries, and also a common foreign policy. So there's a foreign minister for member states of the EU, right? There's a French foreign minister, there's a German foreign minister, but there's also a foreign minister for the EU in general. And in a lot of multilateral talks, that is who shows up, rather than, say, the foreign minister of Germany. Although the complaints that have been raised about the rationale of the EU, on one hand, while there's this redistribution of wealth between countries, arguably it benefits the core of Europe, especially Germany and France, more than the periphery, so Italy, Greece. And you'll see that in a lot of ways this has played out in the recent history of Europe. So the Greek debt crisis, which we'll talk about shortly, and then also the migration crisis that's currently going on, has impacted the countries very unevenly. And in a lot of ways, there's been benefits accruing to the core, to Germany and France, while Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Southern Mediterranean Europe have been having some more difficulties with those issues. So here's a map of the EU. It's got 505 million people. You can see, we just saw here the 6 founding members. You can see these waves of different countries joining at different times. And most recently, we've got Central Europe and then further Eastern Europe. After the Iron Curtain fell and color revolutions took place in many of these countries, they sort of left the sphere of Soviet influence, of course now would be considered Russian influence, and entered the sphere of European influence. And again, this is a source of ongoing conflict. You're probably familiar with the Russian invasion of, well, supposed invasion of Ukraine and Crimea. This got places like Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia very nervous about growing Russian reassertiveness in this area. And here, of course, we've got Turkey, which is a candidate, although at this point, it's a candidate for this foreseeable future. The current president of the EU stated during his election and then reiterated afterwards that while he's president, Turkey will not become a member of the EU if he has anything to say about it, which of course he does. There are a lot of really compelling reasons for Turkey to become a member, but lately also a lot of compelling reasons, at least from Europe's perspective, why it shouldn't, and we'll go into slightly greater detail about that in a moment. Here's an infrastructure map of the EU. We've got high-speed rail and then connecting lots of cities, but as you can see, it's most well developed in France and Germany and Italy. It is expanding beyond those places, and it is getting easier and easier to travel across Europe by rail. We can see that there is internal economic stratification. So we've got really wealthy countries, somewhat wealthy countries, and then in Central and Eastern Europe, countries that aren't struggling by global standards, but compared to other parts of the EU, are indeed struggling. And this became especially pronounced after the 2008 financial crisis, and then most recently with the Greek debt crisis. Greece has been hit very, very hard by austerity measures, and its economy is in pretty bad shape. And then places like Spain and Ireland, especially Spain, have just incredibly high unemployment right now, especially among younger people. So there's a lot of internal unevenness. Earlier we were comparing the Western European and North American GDPs, and as you know, of course, the United States has a lot of internal unevenness. There is just as much, if not more, in Europe. All right, so I mentioned before that Eastern Europe, until recently, was under the sphere of influence, or actually a part of the USSR, a member state or a satellite state of the USSR. And so for most of the 20th century, after World War II, until the fall of the Iron Curtain in the 90s, Eastern Europe was under state socialism. The economies were working very differently. The infrastructure was centrally planned. Industrialization took place in a very particular way with central planning instead of market forces. And you can still see this. So I recently got back from Warsaw, and to be clear, I'll show you another picture in a moment. Not all of Warsaw looks like this, but the friends I was visiting told me that at least in the early 1990s, mid-1990s, this is what a lot of Warsaw looked like. These bullet holes are actually still there from the Second World War. And they told me that properties like this one, because during the basically rule of the communist government, while Poland was within the Soviet sphere of influence, buildings like this one were not really touched after the Second World War, or not really repaired because the property rights were muddled. There were no resources available. And then since then, some of these properties are still in a strange legal status, and so they haven't been redeveloped yet, and look like this in 2015. But following the breakup of the Soviet sphere of influence, Eastern Europe has become increasingly integrated with Western Europe. So their economies look much more Western European now than they did then. Price and wage controls have been removed. Financial infrastructures such as stock markets, banks, as exist in Western Europe and North America, have become established. Privatization has increased, so the state sector has shrunk. And so here's another picture I took in Warsaw, which contains kind of a lot of interesting things if you look closely. So this building in the background here was a quote-unquote gift of the Soviet Union to the Polish people. It's called the Palace of Science and Technology. It looks kind of like Terminal Tower in Cleveland, although I hope that Terminal Tower is less ugly. So we've got, still at the center of Warsaw, this Soviet-era building, which a lot of people in Warsaw really hate. We've got a really nice streetcar system, which is predates even Soviet times, although it was rebuilt then because, of course, it was mostly destroyed during the Second World War. But we've got, this infrastructural legacy. But then we have these modern skyscrapers sprouting up. This one was completed, but a lot more are under construction. So the skyline of Warsaw will look a lot different, even in another 5-10 years. So in Poland, which 15-20 years ago was still considered pretty much an economic backwater compared to the rest of Western Europe, we see a huge increase in integration. And just walking around these cities, they feel a lot like walking around Western European cities, and you'll get that sense if you visit. Okay, to give you an idea of Europe's decision-making bodies, it gets a little bit complicated. You're probably very used to the decision-making bodies of the United States, the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. It's a little bit different in the EU because, of course, each of these countries have their own internal decision-making bodies, which to some extent translates up to the continent and in some ways doesn't. So let me just discuss briefly each of these. So the largest one is the European Parliament. It's the main legislative body and also budgetary authority for the EU, although it shares that with the Council of the European Union, the third one that I've listed here, not to be confused with the European Council, which is a separate thing. Confusing, but bear with me. So right now, the European Parliament has 751 members that are directly elected by about 500 million European citizens. So that makes it the biggest direct democratic electorate in the world, besides, of course, India. The European Council is composed of the heads of state of each of the member states, so of course are elected within those member states. The Council of Europe, very confusingly named in contrast to the European Council, is a council of ministers, so one minister from each state that has legislative and some executive and budget-making powers. So 28 ministers, one from each state, go to the Council of Europe. But this is the extra confusing part, depending what the Council is discussing. So let's say it's trade, it will be economic ministers who show up. Let's say it's agriculture, it will be agricultural ministers who show up. Foreign policy, foreign ministers will show up. So the Council of Europe, it's one minister from each country, but the composition changes depending on what is being discussed. The European Commission is the executive branch of the European Union, and it does have a president who is nominated by the European Council and then approved by the European Parliament. Then there's the Court of Justice, which is the judicial branch, the central bank, which comprises all of the different banks from the different member states and is governed by a board of national governors. So this is very similar and comparable to the US Federal Reserve. And then finally, the Council of Auditors, which oversees budget expenditures. And as far as the budget goes, until recently, the Common Agricultural Policy played a very important part in the European budget. There's also structural and cohesion funds, which mainly flow from the main member states, the richest member states, to the lagging regions or newcomers. So countries that are having economic difficulties, especially Greece, Italy, Central and Eastern Europe, and countries that have more recently joined the EU. The EU Common Agricultural Policy was accounting for a huge percentage of EU expenditures, basically to protect agriculture in the EU. The main goals were price stabilization, subsidizing farmers' income, allowing for product specialization. So this is all of the specialty crops, specialty agricultural products, cheeses, wines, what have you, that you can get from Europe, and also to stabilize food supplies. Now, what's remarkable about this level of spending on protectionist agriculture is that actually a very small percentage of the population is actually employed in the agricultural sector in Europe, about 3%. So although everyone in the continent, of course, relies on the agricultural sector, as far as employment, it's a very large expenditure for the number of people who are employed. Some challenges facing the EU. So the most famous recent, of course, a series of debt crises brought on by the global economic crisis of 2008 and 9. European debt crises really got going in 2009-10 and have not really abated since. Greece is still in the throes of its debt crisis. So the countries that were hardest hit in terms of having huge amounts of debt were Ireland, Greece, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Cyprus. And most of the money that they owed was being lent by Germany, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Belgium. And there were questions at the time, and very recently in Greece's case, about whether these states could remain in the Eurozone. So whether they could keep using the euro, the common currency, or whether they needed to resolve their sovereign debt by reverting to their own currency. And there was some speculation, especially in the case of Greece, a Greek exit, a Grexit from the European Union would kind of spell the doom of the Eurozone. It was narrowly avoided, but it's an ongoing crisis with a lot of no love lost between Greek leaders and then the European Council, especially Germany, France, the UK, and among those especially Germany, the main creditors of Greece. This is a protest, probably, I think, in Athens, against measures that were being forced upon Greece by the creditors. So austerity measures, which were, of course, very, very unpopular in Greece because it decreases government spending, decreases employment opportunities. So Greeks have gone through a lot in the past few years, and especially the past few months, economically speaking. Then there's this ongoing question of what exactly is Europe? Who gets to be included? There are a few states in Europe, and these aren't mentioned in your textbook, that are not actually EU members. In some cases, Norway, Iceland, this is by choice, or somewhat by choice. The two sides have agreed that it's basically not in those countries' interest to join. In Turkey's case, it's been a lot more contentious. So here we've got some arguments in favor of or against the accession of Turkey to the European Union. So in terms of geography, the argument against would be that Turkey isn't part of Europe, Western Europe. It's located in Asia. It's too big for the EU to absorb. On the other hand, Istanbul is a European city that functions as a bridge between Europe and Asia. In terms of politics, and this is a major sticking point for European leaders, they argue that that Turkey is not, they would put it as advanced enough in terms of European-style democracy. On the other hand, Turkey is a NATO ally. It does have a democracy. It just isn't the kind of democracy that Europe wants it to be. Economically speaking, there's a mismatch between the EU and Turkey. And then culturally, many Europeans see Turkey as not part of Europe. And you probably remember the Ottoman Empire. This was the big bad wolf during World War I. So they've been seen as outsiders, historically speaking, and as recently as the 20th century, were fighting. Although, of course, the same could be said of France and Germany. On the other hand, the argument would be that since the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Turkey has been fully entwined in Europe's history, and that having Turkey join the EU would be a clear sign that Europe is open to the Islamic world. Now, all of this is getting a lot more complicated in the context of the European migrant crisis, and the Syrian civil war has really changed Europe's outlook on this, and particularly the role that Turkey plays as a buffer between Europe and the Middle East, but also as a country through which hundreds of thousands of refugees, mostly from Syria, but also from places like Afghanistan, Eritrea, Pakistan, Nigeria, Somalia, Sudan, have been coming as well. But more on the migration crisis in a moment. I want to talk about Europe's population curve, population pyramid, but first I want to introduce how to read one. So here we've got the United States in 2003. Age is on the vertical axis, so here we've got people over 80, here we've got people who are 0, they've just been born. And we've got male on the left, female on the right. By looking at this, you can see basically what is the share of population for a certain age and a certain gender. So, of course, we can see a stark difference here in the US in 2003, who's surviving past the age of 80. Many more women than men are living past the age of 80 at birth, more or less equal. And we can see that there's a big share. So here's the baby boom. There's a big share of the population in middle age. And of course, as in 2015, this whole section would have moved up. Those folks are now 12 years older. So you can see the baby boom. If you looked at these pyramids from the 1950s until now, you would see it appear and then move up the chart. So a population undergoing rapid growth would look like this. So here's Nigeria. You can see that a huge percentage of the population is very, very young because birth rates are very high. This is what a population undergoing slow growth looks like. This is the United States, just a little bit above replacement rate. And then here we see what a zero, or possibly even bordering on a negative growth population looks like. So here in the US, you can see kind of a more cylindrical thing, but it's clear here that birth rates are decreasing somewhat in Germany. And that's what's going on with Europe as a whole. So remember, birth is down here. We have some very large generations, but you can see historical signals like the birth deficit during World War I, the birth deficit during World War II, the baby boom, and then the baby bust. And because Europe has such a low birth rate, its population is starting to decline and will continue to decline unless it's stabilized by migration. So a large part of this migration in the 60s and 70s came in the form of guest workers who could only come for a few years, were admitted without families. 12, 14 million had come, I think, by the 1970s. A lot of them then became undocumented immigrants, attracted to economic prosperity and opportunities in Europe. And then, of course, there's the matter of political refugees. So yet another reason, by the way, for the accession of Turkey to the EU is that there are a lot of Turkish people living in Europe, several million alone, just in Germany. So even if political unification hasn't happened, there's been a lot of cultural exchange going back a long time, and a lot of this from the guest worker program. More recently, there's the European migration crisis. So this has seen, and it's really, during 2015, it's reached unprecedented levels. So 500,000 people have already entered Europe by sea this year. Another 500,000 are in Turkey waiting to enter. Thousands have died on the way because they're squeezed into really unsafe boats like this by human smugglers and are just in very uncomfortable, unsafe conditions. And once they reach Europe, a lot of them entering through Greece and Italy, because of course that's how you can reach Europe by sea. Once they reach Europe, they don't want to stay in Greece and Italy because those countries have economic crises of their own. The best economic opportunities are in places like Germany and France, and that's where the migrants are trying to get. But on the way there, they're crossing all of these European borders, which some countries have made straightforward for them, but some countries, such as Hungary, have made very difficult. Hungary, most notably and recently, by building a border fence. And when trains have been shut down or made unavailable to these migrants, they've just been walking across Europe, trying to get where they're going. Now, most of these migrants would be recognized as refugees, not necessarily economic migrants, but refugees who are fleeing persecution, who are fleeing war, especially in Syria, Afghanistan, and Eritrea. And most of those asylum seekers are being approved. So in 2015, so far, 94% of Syrian asylum seekers have been recognized, 90% of Eritreans, 88% of Iraqis, 66% of Afghans, 65% of Iranians, 60% of Somalis, and 53% of Sudanese. And those people collectively account for 90% of who's arriving in Greece during the first half of 2015. And Europe is already a highly international, highly multicultural place. So London, for instance, is a true world city in the sense that more than 270 nationalities are represented there. I talked about the legacy of colonialism, so you can see this not just in the colonies, but also in the former colonizer. So a lot of the cultures that are most dominantly represented in London are their former colonies, especially India and Africa. There's this enduring question, though, of how to incorporate immigrants, refugees, and ethnic minorities into Europe. So we talked about this with North America, the differing approaches taken by the United States and by Canada. On one extreme, we have multiculturalism, in which each ethnic group is considered as having the right to enjoy and protect their own identity and native cultures, as opposed to assimilation, which would demand that people from different cultural backgrounds who are in the same place need to some extent, leave behind their own cultures and identities and instead adopt a national identity. Say, be German before you are Turkish, even if you were born in Turkey, but are living in Berlin. So in Europe, what this has mostly looked like is luckily the latter. People are respected and encouraged for maintaining their own identities. They're not forced to assimilate. On the other hand, living in Europe brings a comprehensive change in lifestyle, in language. There have also been some more contentious political debates over recent immigration, especially from the Middle East. So there's a lot of xenophobia, there's a lot of Islamophobia in Europe from right-wing parties, especially in places like Eastern Germany, but also in seemingly more enlightened countries. So Europe is facing a lot of challenges moving forward, economically speaking, in terms of the migrant crisis, in terms of its identity, and basically how to govern all of these member states, the extent to which they can work together, and then the extent to which conflict will continue. So even though it's 2015 and there's a lot of European integration, if you look closely at European history, you'll see the same sorts of divisions that have existed for centuries, going back to the Peace of Westphalia, and then also some crises and some identity conflicts and crises that literally are taken straight from a few centuries ago. So last fall, when Scotland had a referendum that may have seen it leave the UK, that is a conflict that has been going on for centuries. A conflict of identity that's been going on for centuries. So although Europe is, relatively speaking, a highly developed place, its story is not yet complete. And if you look closely, you'll be able to see that these current events do in fact link hundreds of years back to the past. So thank you for listening to Module 6. Good luck with your quiz. Good luck with your project and assignments. We'll talk again next week.